Today, you won't want to miss my conversation with my friend Conrad Black when we reflect on his story about being with the President of the United States when they learned the news of the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk. We'll also talk about the historic time that our country's in as we talk about the choices, the future that faces our nation. Well, we know that we've got to get our country back on track, Conrad Black. And so I wanted to start off, though, with a very heartfelt story that it is really remarkable that you were present. Uh, and that has to do with the tragic, horrifying assassination of Charlie Kirk. He was an activist, an advocate for reason, respectful discussion, and an advocate for truth. And within that context, it's really remarkable that you were there in the Oval Office
Yes,
when President Trump and Vice President Vance received the tragic news that Charlie Kirk had died. What was that like?
it was very dramatic. When I arrived, um, I'd seen on my iPhone that he'd been injured. There'd been an attempt on his life, but there was no comment on what his condition was. So naturally, I was hopeful that he'd recover. Like President Reagan or something. He was injured but would recover, and and then I had to wait. I arrived early, as one does, for the meeting with the president, and then when I was invited into his office, we started talking, and he invited me to talk about certain things. So that's what we were talking about. And uh, Art Laffer, the famous economist, came in just to have a photo op shaking hands with President Trump in front of the painting of President Reagan, you see, beside the
Hmm.
president's desk. And then he went out, and then a young man who works there in the president's office came in and handed him a note, and this was that. I mean, I didn't know until he said it, obviously, that Charlie Kirk had died. We both said what a horrible thing that was, and then a couple of minutes later, the vice president, who was a good friend of Charlie Kirk's, came in, and he had been on the phone uh, talking to the investigators on site, and they had a good idea who this guy was. At least they had a picture of him, and he'd been described and so on. And apparently, some crank, some absolute lunatic, stood up and said, "I did it. I killed him. I shot him." And it was it wasn't true. He was just one of these rather irrational people. But they then, by this time, the vice president said they have a picture of this guy, and they don't think they're going to have a lot of trouble finding him. And and then they talked, and I didn't feel it was my place to say anything at this stage. I offered to leave, and the president said, "No, don't stay there." And and then these two talked about it. And the reason I wrote it was not to say, I was in the office when this happened. It was
Hmm.
just that for 20 minutes, neither of them uttered one vindictive or nasty or cynical word. None of them said anything about, our enemies did this, we'll get them. It was nothing like that. It was nothing except sadness at their friend's death, and concern for his family, and concern at the level of violence in the country.
Hmm.
And I was the one who said, "Well, look, it's a terrible, horrible thing, but surely it is so appalling that there will be a backlash that's useful here, not
Hmm.
in a partisan sense, but in a pressure to lower the temperature and be a little more civil." And they weren't so convinced that would happen, but that was it. They didn't raise that point. I did, um, and I
Well,
didn't raise it in a partisan way, but
mhm.
just, I mean, look, 95% of Americans don't approve of murdering people, so
Mhm.
shouldn't that fact, at a time like that, impress opinion a bit? And that was my point. But then the vice president left, and we got back to talking what I was invited to come and discuss with the president. But
Mhm.
I put my points extremely succinctly, and then I left. But he said that he had to phone Mrs. Kirk at this point. While the two were talking, and I was there, but I didn't say much. I was thinking, this is it's a terrible thing that's happened, but this is a historic moment. These are the only
Mhm.
two people in the United States that the whole country votes for. They've just got two holders of national office, and there they were.
It's a really remarkable vignette or story of a human response to an incredible tragedy. And of course,
It was reassuring to me that the two elected leaders of the country were so focused on the human side of it and not on politics at all.
mhm. So I did want to reflect with you a little bit about the larger perspective here, because you have been a keen observer and participant in so many affairs, including as a historian. So if we look at this moment, we've seen the reaction since that tragedy on so many levels. One of which was the incredible memorial service to Charlie Kirk, and well, the heartfelt um, reflections by his widow, um, Erica Kirk.
Yes,
And we certainly won't forget those remarks. And we also saw really hundreds of millions really um, get into the conversation about the significance of Charlie Kirk's life as an advocate for freedom of speech and truth. And we've also seen other, frankly, horrifying responses to the death of another person, which is another topic. But I guess if we look at the larger picture, is this a yet again a moment in history where there seems to be a break now in our culture that is realizing that this wokeness, this radical left, is somehow being recognized for its intolerance and many would argue a proclivity to violence? Is this a kind of a historic moment where this effort to continue to promote things such as, well, DEI and transgenderism, all kinds of things that stem out of a hateful ideology that seeks to divide people, not unite them, is finally perhaps breaking in our culture? Is this finally an end to this kind of magical thinking that really isn't based on truth or reason, but is really, have people said enough with this wokeness?
I think you've got two aspects to it. Substantially, I think the answer is partly yes. Um, Charlie Kirk had seen him. I met him once, but I really didn't know much about him. I didn't know that much about Turning Point USA. I'm a Christian, but not an evangelical Christian. And I knew that he was very successful at going around to university campuses and uh, putting forth a conservative and a anti-atheistic viewpoint, a Christian viewpoint. But I didn't realize how prominent he was in that area. And I think what has happened is that obviously, virtually everybody was appalled. I mean, almost everybody disapproves of murdering people. Um, but I think that first of all, the fact that the president's political opponents appeared to be much more concerned about the firing of Jimmy Kimmel, who's a pretty tired old late night commentator who he thinks he's
Mhm.
amusing, but I don't think anyone else does, and who said on that occasion the critical words that the president was mourning the death of Charlie Kirk the way a 4-year-old child cries over a dead goldfish. Now, that's just not an acceptable thing to say. I mean,
Mhm.
obviously, there's freedom of speech. He has a right to say it, but it is a terribly tasteless and offensive thing to say.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
the fact that the Democrats appear to be more concerned about the instability of his position as a late night host than they were about murdering this man who was much admired by tens of millions of people and was a good man. I mean, it's not as if he was a controversial
Hmm.
demagogue stirring the
Right.
pot and urging people into the paths of violence. He was a pacifist in domestic terms.
Hmm.
And I think that has shocked people. And I think it is another of these instances where the Democrats in general, and particularly the more fervent, woke Democrats, have piled onto an issue on the 20% or even 10% side of it
Hmm.
against the great majority. And I think, in addition, in the memorial service that you mentioned, which was a remarkable occasion, I thought that, and I'm not questioning anyone's sincerity here, but in addition to the sincere statements of the many speakers, and in particular the widow of Charlie Kirk and the leading officials of the administration, the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, secretary of defense, and secretary of health and human services, they aligned the administration very closely with the Judeo Christian traditions of America.
Hmm.
And they did it without any intolerance to people who don't share those views. There was no criticism of any non Christians, and there was nothing immoderate in what they said. But they aligned the administration very closely to those traditions and invoked a divine intelligence, all of them, to some degree or other, in a way that it seems to me, and I'm not suggesting this was all tactical, but may have entered the minds of some of them, um, moves the Democrats, the woke Democrats. I'm not talking about the governor of Pennsylvania. I'm talking
Hmm.
about the Squad and AOC and Adam Schiff and some of these people. Moves them in the public mind out of the mainstream and into an area where they're ambiguous about violence. They're not saying go
Hmm.
out and murder people, but
Hmm.
when you're more upset about a clapped out, not very funny late night author of what he thinks to be aphorisms being suspended than you are about
Hmm.
a respected, much admired leader of a movement of tens of millions of people being murdered. You're way outside the mainstream politically, and I
Hmm.
think the Democrats may have just identified themselves with too many lost causes here. You know,
Indeed.
they were much less concerned about millions of people entering the country illegally than they were
Hmm.
about the civil rights of some of those who were deported, even though they were clearly odious people. I mean,
Hmm.
even odious people have their rights, but as an issue to get worked up about, it is not comparable to having let millions of such people in the first place. And you know, they're, as far as I can see, they've been, you know, they were they've been on the wrong side of environment extremism. You know,
Hmm.
they've just drawn the short straw for themselves in policy and policy approval terms too often, and I think they're becoming a chronic minority temporarily. I mean, ultimately, over time in the United States, both sides come to bat, and half the people are on one side and half on
Hmm.
the other. But right now, in the great struggle that Trump had to first get control of the Republican Party and then get control of the administration and the Congress and public policy, his victory is overwhelming at this point. And
Hmm.
part of it is his skill, and for the most part, I think the correct interpretation he gives to most of these issues. But part of it is the Democrats are essentially on a suicide path here in electoral terms.
Hmm. Well, it's certainly an interesting moment because we know that culture is in many ways upstream to policy. It kind of sets the table in terms of what's possible. So it just seems to me that this is yet again, we'll see how things unfold, is a kind of a historical breaking in the culture of how people now are recognizing that the call for violence or the lack of condemnation of a
Look,
terrible violent
even
act.
even these outrageous mischaracterizations. I mean, comparing any living American to Hitler
Mhm. Mhm.
is outrageous. I mean,
Yeah, it really is.
it apart from anything else, it trivializes the tragedy of Hitler's victims. I mean,
Mhm.
12 million people, half of them Jews and half other groups, murdered in the death camps.
Mhm.
And he plunged the world into a war in which 70 million people died. Now, you
Mhm.
can't perhaps blame him for the people who died in the Far East, but you can for all those who died in
Mhm.
Europe. It was his war.
Exactly.
And and you can't. I mean, Hillary Clinton has no business comparing Trump to Hitler.
Mhm.
It's scandalous, and
Yeah.
it's not for me to say that that kind of loose, demagogic, defamatory talk encourages people to go out and kill public figures or
Mhm.
shoot at them. At least I don't know that, and I don't know that in the cases of the individuals involved here.
Mhm.
But it does create a coarse, nasty atmosphere that contributes nothing to the elucidation of the issues. You've got legitimate differences of opinion here on how to
Mhm.
handle key policies. And you're not helping either side or the process of working it out by likening people you disagree with, but who
Mhm.
don't aspire to do anything unconstitutional or criminal, likening them to the most evil people in history
Mhm.
who were
Mhm.
responsible for more deaths of innocent people than anyone in history. I mean, it's such a hideous exaggeration that, as I said, it trivializes the crimes that Hitler committed. I mean, people who don't know anything about history will conclude, oh, Hitler went around making speeches criticizing his enemies and calling them funny names and pounded the table the way Trump has done at times. They wouldn't realize that Trump, their president, was being compared to someone who literally packed 12 million people into cattle cars and sent them to be gassed in ovens. I mean,
Yeah. No, it's
you
really
just can't
outrageous.
get into that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, we're missing also the whole point that freedom of speech in our free and democratic societies is foundational. And so if we just work to shut people down, whether it's censorship or ad hominem attacks or even libeling them or slandering them, we do not do our society any favors. We are undermining the health of our society. So I think this is a moment where my hope, my prayer is that people wake up to the fact that we need freedom of speech more than ever.
Yes, of course, but we mustn't abuse it. I mean, that's not a contradiction. Of course, people look.
Mhm.
I want to be clear. Hillary Clinton and everyone else have the right to compare Trump to Hitler if they want to. I can't say they can't
Mhm.
do it. They can do it. It's a free country, and you can do that if you want to. But they shouldn't do it. And she's a former first lady of the country, a former U.S. senator, secretary of
Mhm.
state, and candidate for president who actually won the popular vote and came very close in the
Mhm.
election. She has a duty to act and speak responsibly.
Yeah,
And I mean,
exactly.
she's a
But
pillar of the system, and is therefore the Clinton family has gained
mhm,
great fame and distinction as a result of that system. And they should do their part to preserve the system and treat it in a dignified way, and not
indeed.
compare their chief opponent to the most evil person in history.
Yeah, let's call each other in the legacy of Charlie Kirk. He went on to campuses. He went into all kinds of forums to reason. He didn't go there to berate people. He went there to
Of
reason,
course.
and that's what he did, and
And
that's
and
the
and he, and
legacy.
he didn't try and shut them down. He'd say, "Prove me wrong. We're having an exchange here.
Yes,
I want to talk with
indeed.
you." By the way, I'm getting a little out of my depth here, but just following up on your previous question, I thought when Mrs. Kirk said that she forgave the assassin because she thought that was in the proper tradition of Christ saying on the cross, "Forgive
Mhm.
them; they know not what they do." I think that was a statement, whatever anyone's religious views or religious denomination, if they have one. I thought that was a statement that had an immense impact on people, as it deserved to have. It was a profoundly, I mean, it's Christian, obviously, because of whom she was
Mhm.
quoting, but a profoundly human and decent and generous thing to say in a terribly, terribly difficult time for her.
A remarkable moment.
You know?
So, Conrad, I want to turn a little bit to our own domestic affairs quickly, and I want to start off with the economy. We know that we've got a lot of challenges in this country called Canada. We've got a stagnant economy. We've all seen the charts where we're at less than 1% of growth per capita GDP, the economy over some 10 years. We are coming up on a budget apparently on November 4, but we still don't really have a budget. We're anticipating, I've seen estimates of $90 billion deficit federally alone. It could be even much higher. We've got an outflow of money out of this country. Our average incomes in Canada are approaching 40, 50% less than average incomes in the United States.
Yes. And we're being
How do we
passed by
get
other
this
countries.
country back?
I mean,
How do we
David,
move
I'm older
forward?
than you, but even when you were young, and certainly when I was, we were neck and neck with Australia behind the United States as the
Indeed. Yes.
wealthiest per capita. And I'm leaving out petro states and tax haven states. I'm not talking about countries with 300,000 people where nobody pays taxes like Luxembourg. I'm talking about integrated economies of
Mhm.
substantial countries. The Americans were first, and we in Australia were neck and neck with each other right behind them. But as you say, we're now, the Americans are 50% ahead of us. But I mean, when I was born, it was just at the end of the Second World War. Netherlands, the Dutch had bravely blown their dikes to try and make life difficult for the German army that was occupying them. And the Allied Canadian army mainly pushed the Germans out of the Netherlands. But,
Mhm.
when armies go through, they cause terrible damage with tanks and artillery and so on. And the Netherlands was a small, flooded country, much of which had been smashed to rubble. They have no resources. And today, they have a higher standard of living than we do. We're just not
Mhm.
competitive. As you said, the capital outflows here net, that is to say, the amount by which um, capital generated in Canada is exported out and invested elsewhere,
Mhm.
exceeds that which comes in from other countries to invest in Canada. In the last 10 years is well over $300 billion. And we are being passed successively by other countries in the per capita disposable income category. So we aren't competitive, and people who aren't competitive, countries that aren't competitive, come to terrible grief if they don't pull up their socks and do better. And if Carney thinks he's going to get there with a 90 billion deficit, especially if it includes any of his nonsense about climate, then it's going to be a disaster. Now we shouldn't prejudge. Well, I have no idea what his budget is, and I hope it's a
Mhm.
creative, imaginative, and effective budget. But time is going by, and everyone's entitled to a honeymoon when they come in. I think that's a good thing. But he's delivering, as you said, that budget, or his minister of finance is on I think November 4, and
Mhm.
that's 6 months after he came in as prime minister. That was the
Mhm.
time between Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway, where
Mhm.
the Japanese onslaught across the Pacific, and then the Americans pushed them back. And
Mhm.
after that, they moved steadily towards the home islands of Japan. Well, the whole world changed in that time, and the 6 months is a long time in politics.
Yeah, so it's 6 months, and I guess my question to you, Conrad, given your substantive network around the world, what are you hearing? Like, I'm hearing that there's not a sense of urgency. There's announcements regarding this project office. We still have not seen a pipeline. In fact, we've seen the clip from Mark Carney talking about the so-called grand bargain of decarbonization, and then we'll start getting these other projects going. And we've seen also the response from the leader of the opposition saying, well, if you keep all these policies in place, like net zero and the Never Pipeline Bill, C-69, there's a whole list of them, the tanker ban on the West Coast, how are we going to move this country forward? Our major industry is oil and gas, among many others. and it's still kind of the same policies. So I guess my question is this really a change in government or is it just a change in leadership and tone?
Well,
Are
we,
you
we have to
optimistic?
wait. If Kearney doesn't, let me put it very directly. What appears to be this grand bargain of he'll allow a pipeline, but is talking about it being a carbon neutral pipeline, which is just a
Mhm.
ridiculous concept. We don't need pipelines to carry water from Alberta to British Columbia or Ontario. But the bargain appears to be that he'll approve a pipeline as long as there's a carbon collection and a burial of carbon up near Red Lake or something that costs $16 billion, and the federal
Mhm.
government will pay for it. Alberta won't pay any of it. I mean, I guess for someone of his, in my opinion, absurd views on the imminent danger of climate change, um, I guess that's a compromise. And if he did that, it would at least be an improvement on what we've had for the last 10 years, which was
Mhm.
essentially a war on our greatest industry and the chief engine of prosperity in this country. But let me take it one step further. If he doesn't move on a pipeline, if he doesn't take serious steps, I don't mean bureaucratic window dressing about a major projects office. That's just more bureaucracy. I mean, everyone
Mhm.
knows a pipeline's a pipeline, and it's well known how you build them. You dig
Mhm.
a space for them and put a pipe down. And if he doesn't get on with that, then in my opinion, we're going to be very soon in the position where the majority of Albertans would vote for Alberta to secede from Canada and become an independent country. And then they would make a deal with the United States, either to sell the Americans oil and gas at a reasonable price, not the knockdown price the Americans are getting now, or to go back to XL, ship from Alberta all the way to the
Mhm.
Gulf of Mexico or America, whatever you want to call it, and and then to the world. And if Alberta did that, it would be a petro state. It wouldn't need an income tax. It would have the highest standard of living
Mhm.
in the world of any country.
Mhm.
And people, Edmonton and Calgary would become the size of Toronto, and they wouldn't have to listen to any more nonsense from Ottawa ever again. Now that's
Right.
the position we're going to be in. And by the way, if Alberta did that, Quebec would do it a month later. I mean, the leader of the Parti Québécois, which at this point is ahead in the polls for the Quebec election next year, has said that if elected, he will recognize Alberta as an independent country, even if they
Indeed.
haven't
Yes.
achieved that status.
Yeah.
I mean, the Québécois have figured out that the Albertans are not far from being as dubious about Canada's utility to them as Quebec is.
Mhm.
Now, this is
Well,
a
and don't
shocking
forget about
state for this country
Saskatchewan.
to be in. Now, maybe Carney knows all about it and has a strategy to
Mhm.
deal with it. I hope he does, but we don't know.
Right. So you're seeing, in many respects, a significant foreshadow between Alberta, Quebec, and let's don't forget Saskatchewan, where provinces are going to be asserting their sovereignty if they can't find a pathway to prosper. I
Well, if
mean,
they're being strangled economically, frankly, they're
mhm,
right to secede. I mean, what good is Canada to them? And we, if that's the policy, I mean, and we have to be mindful of what
mhm,
Alberta's been through. Pierre Trudeau tried to seize the profits of that industry, and Justin Trudeau's tried to shut the industry down. I mean, why should Alberta put up with that? I mean, why
exactly.
should Canada put up with it? It's an insane policy, but it's Alberta's oil and Saskatchewan.
So the other economic fall I want to get your feedback on and perspective, Conrad, has to do with what is it again? Oh, trade. And the whole challenge of getting a trade deal with the United States of America. So you know the president, you know the administration. What do we need to do to get a trade deal and move
You
forward?
know,
Because it's this uncertainty that's
when I
deadly
was
to
visiting the
business
president
investment.
2 weeks ago, he said to me, "What's the state of the trade talks with Canada?" And I said, "Mr. President, I mean, you're supposed to know that. I don't know. I have nothing to do with it. I mean, I was actually hoping you would tell me." he doesn't actually think about Canada that much, and that's in the hands of officials. I think
Mhm.
as it should be. You've got trade experts
For sure.
talking to each other, and I assume that they're proceeding in a civilized, reasonable manner. But and we have, I think, about 75% of the trade between the two countries is governed by the treaty, and neither party's
Yes.
given notice of cancellation. So, we
Mhm.
don't have it all hanging over us right now like a sword of Damocles. But the new government in Ottawa had better work diligently to get a proper agreement. And the American view is that Canada is going to lose all of its steel industry and all of its automobile industry. And
Oh.
now I said to him that if that was the case, then the Canadians should buy the auto factories in Canada, obviously at a very knocked down price, and and make the cars in Canada for Canadians. I mean, I said, Mr. President, if you think that you can impose on Canada policies that are effectively eliminate the Canadian auto industry, I wouldn't have any expectation, if I were you, of selling any American cars in Canada. I mean, we got the auto factories, we'll build other kinds of
Mhm.
cars in them and buy them ourselves. But I said, I don't, technically, I don't know anything about it. I mean, I was hoping you could tell me. But look, on that one, David, I assume that reason will prevail. I mean, he has
Mhm.
no animus to Canada. He didn't like Trudeau, but he has no objection to Carney, and he likes the country. He knows Canada well. He used to come and ski in the Laurentians all the time when he was a young man.
Mhm.
That's where he met his first wife, and he likes Canada.
Mhm.
And So he's not trying to put us to the wall. He made some injudicious remarks, and the Liberal Party ran with it. And Carney put on his Churchill act that we'll fight in the hills and the streets and
Mhm.
all this nonsense. But all's fair in politics. He got away with it, but it was a load of codswallop, all of it. But I assume we'll work it out like reasonable people.
Well, let's hope so. It's fascinating though, the dynamic I think within the Canadian populace is real concern about the
They
relationship with
have
the
they have
United
every
States.
reason to be concerned. I think they are concerned.
Um,
And when you said earlier, what does the world think? The world thinks Canada is an absurdly woke country. Even the
mm,
Europeans, who are pretty wimpy by American standards on all of this
mhm,
stuff, and have made terrible mistakes about admitting masses of foreigners who aren't immigrating the way our ancestors did to this country,
mhm,
anxious to join a new nationality, be part of it, and help build the country they're moving
mhm,
to. I mean, that's like the waves of people in the fourth and fifth centuries, who came ahead of the Huns and the
mhm,
nastier barbarians and crowded into the Roman Empire. They had no loyalty to Rome. They just wanted to move to a more comfortable place, and
mhm.
and that's what the Europeans are getting, and the Americans have stopped it. I mean, Trump has stopped illegal immigration, and many of your viewers would have seen his remarks at the United Nations earlier this week,
Mhm.
and I think he called it the two-tailed dragon. If you don't control immigration and allow the climate fanatics to strangle the
Mhm.
economy, you're going to lose your countries. Everything is going to fail, and
Absolutely.
the Americans are showing the way in these things. But in Europe, as you know, they've allowed a lot of immigration of relatively unskilled people without making any provision for increased
Mhm.
housing or the social safety net. So they're overburdening their government structure, creating terrible pressures on housing prices for especially for lower income groups. So
Mhm.
the lower income citizens of those countries are complaining, and they're not complaining because we don't want foreigners here. They're complaining because their own standard of living is being depressed, but they're
Exactly.
being accused of racism and persecuted as racists when in fact they are victims of the incompetence of their governments. Well, you can't.
Indeed.
Their democracies are
Exactly.
all going to be thrown out.
Yeah. Well, and what's also very concerning is we've got, the last time I checked, some 3.2 temporary visa workers in Canada, and we've got record levels of youth unemployment. I mean, that's the next generation that need that first job, the entry point into becoming an adult. I mean, this is a policy that's really undermining our society.
Yes. No, it absolutely does. At least here, we only have a border with one country, and we don't have a lot of Americans, desperate to get in here, the way, say, people from the Middle East are desperate to get into Western Europe, but or people from south of the United States are desperate to get into the United States. But
Mhm.
so for us, it's a relatively easy problem to deal with. But uh, but we've got to deal with it. I mean,
We've got to
the
deal
fact,
with it.
frankly, whether it's easy to deal with or not doesn't matter if you're not dealing with it.
Mhm. I want to turn to so-called green energy, and we could highlight so much here in terms of further revelations about the so-called science regarding the models. There's been, long time claims that the world is coming to an end with climate change. Um, the President Donald Trump called all green is bankrupt. We've got Germany now backtracking on a lot of policy around quote green energy, as Germany itself has energy costs some three times higher
Bringing back
than North
nuclear
America.
power, which Chancellor Merkel shut down. It's
Mhm.
clean. It's clean energy. It's recognized to be clean energy.
Exactly. So in this context, are we seeing a bigger strategic, frankly, implosion? The house of cards that's kind of built around green energy, is
I
it
believe
is it
so.
falling
And
apart?
and and the greatest engine just starting up of this trend is, and it's very educational how these things, different issues, come together. I think it is when Trump discovered the proportions of Western European purchases of Russian gas, and just recognized right away that the Europeans were calling on the Americans to help repel Russia from Ukraine, while they were in fact financing the war for Russia by buying gas from them. And
Insane.
then they developed
Yeah.
this fatuous
Mhm.
idea that makes the appeasers of the 1930s look like legendary warriors of Churchillian demeanor, that they would stop this in 2 years. Well, I understand that Trump met with the European leaders who are in New York for the General Assembly of the United Nations, and I saw the interview on Fox News last night with the president of Finland, very articulate man,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
Trump has said, "Look, we'll find alternate sources for you. We can provide some, and friendly members of OPEC like Nigeria and Saudi Arabia and Indonesia, we'll all build it up and replace Russia as your source. We'll have to use more tankers, obviously. You can't pipeline it all, but we can do it. But you've got to do your part. We are not going to take the lead in defeating Russian aggression, which is being financed by you, just as you're asking us to do it."
Mhm.
And so I think it's all sorting out now. And I see the American position is Russia's got to get out of Ukraine completely. And I think there's no doubt that when Trump says that he can make it impossible for Russia to continue this war, he can. I mean, I believe he's covered everything with the isolationists in his own party
Mhm.
by
Mhm.
by bullying Europe into raising its defense budgets, which five previous presidents were asking for but didn't get it. And so he's selling very sophisticated American weapons to Europe. Europe's giving it to Ukraine. Russia will be facing a much
Mhm.
more dangerous military opponent, and the Russian civil population will get a taste of missiles and bombs and armed drones overhead that the
Mhm.
Russians have kindly inflicted upon the Ukrainians. And the American secondary sanctions will be such that Russia's income is going to collapse. Now, Russia has a GDP smaller than Canada. It's
Mhm.
taken over 1 million casualties. It's taken over 50,000 deserters. They can't go on like this. And I give Trump great credit for trying to treat Russia gently in order to help them out of the embrace of China. But Putin has been so stubborn and narrow minded about this, and so bellicose, that he has brought on himself what is going to be a humiliating lesson for Russia, I think.
So in that context, though, I guess the question there as we kind of look to wrap up our conversation is why is Canada then seem to be pursuing still a whole set of green policies that frankly make us uncompetitive then on the energy side
Well, the
and
answer
every
is that
related industry?
people sold that to Justin Trudeau, and Carney was one of the people who sold it to him. I mean, I remember him when he was governor of the Bank of England. He turned the Bank
Mhm.
of England into an agency badgering the country about climate change, which has nothing to do with running a central bank. And
Mhm.
and then, of course, he warned Britain that there'd be grass growing in the streets of London if they left Europe, and they ignored that. And he's not well remembered in Britain. But we're waiting to see on this budget whether he has read the polls, at the least read the polls, and cynically realized he can't go ahead with such a radical energy reduction
Mhm.
program, or or even had the grace of conversion and just
Mhm.
decided that that it's not the right policy right now. Now,
Exactly.
if he does either of those, I think we'll turn in the right direction and things will start getting better. We'll increase our energy exports and it'll all come along. It's a rich country with a talented and highly motivated workforce. There's nothing wrong with Canada that better government wouldn't solve. But if he doesn't, he's going to have a real sleigh ride,
Okay,
and we're all
so
going to suffer for it.
indeed. So just to wrap up my other question I wanted to explore with you is what is the larger strategic play for Canada to summarize it? I mean, obviously, we we can make trade with the United States. We've got to move our own policy house in order. We need free trade in Canada. We need to get rid of that red tape so that instead of repelling capital, we attract business investment to this country. We should be the most prosperous nation in the world, darn it. So, in that context, though, the larger play surely relates to security as a continent, doesn't it, Conrad? I mean, instead of the United States making overtures to Finland to supply them with energy, Canada should be the source of that energy. It seems like we
Exactly.
are spinning our wheels when, in fact, we should be working with the Americans to create a secure continent, be a full NATO partner, but clearly being exporting everywhere around the world. Why can't we do this, Conrad?
We can. We can. The burning question is, does Mark Carney have the intelligence and the courage to do, frankly, a 180-degree turn on what he has been saying and what his predecessors in that Liberal government were doing, largely on his advice, or not? I mean, a notorious case of a complete policy turn was the Nazi Soviet Pact. Now, Stalin and Hitler were horrible people, and it was a disaster that started the war. But they had the intelligence to realize that the policy they were pursuing wasn't working for them. I'm not in any other respect trying to suggest we should emulate anything either of them did.
Hmm.
But the point is, people can do it. When Pierre Trudeau campaigned against wage and price controls and then imposed them, it was outrageous. But he did it. I mean, you can change your mind. And in the United States, for example, there were a great many isolationists who were persuaded by Roosevelt and Truman and Eisenhower and others that they
Hmm.
were mistaken. The U.S. couldn't be an isolationist country. Well, if Carney, if he just goes so far as to say, in an ideal world, we would do what I've been advocating, but this isn't an ideal world. And what the Canadian national interest requires now is maximization of energy and natural resources of all kinds exports. That's what we've got to do. We'll do our best with the environment, and we'll do what we can when we can do it. But this is what we've got to do now. If he does that, I think he'll be a successful prime minister. If he sticks to the ideological humbug he's been selling, and his predecessor was peddling, then it's going to be a disaster, and that government won't last long.
So there you have it. That's where we need to go, and this is what we need to do. So thank you very much, Conrad Black, for joining me for this far-reaching
Always a
conversation
pleasure,
today.
David. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.